It's my joy this morning, and I'm going to come down there and sit with you all too, to turn this place over to Greg Noschese, who you all know. Greg's family is always here in the first service, so it's a real treat to have Greg here in the second service. But he's a vital part of this church. He's a vital part of the community, active in Boy Scouts and so many other endeavors where he has the opportunity to give of himself. He asked me about a month ago if he could do a talk sometime, and it works out perfectly because it's something that I want to get back into on a periodic basis, having lay people up here, not only involved in once in a while giving the message, but also involved in other aspects of the church service. So I've heard this story once, and one of the things I look forward to most right now is hearing it again. So, Greg, it's all yours.
Thank you. It was very humbling to spend the week preparing for today. You, as a layperson, sometimes you sit out there and you think that a preacher's job is pretty easy until you try and write a message yourself. And it becomes very cumbersome, very difficult. And then there's this other thing called life that just happens during that same week. And it's just amazing to me to see the way in which David and others continually prepare and have an organized message for us each and every week. And I'm inspired by you, David, and very grateful for this opportunity. My hope is today that I'm going to do a little bit better than I did in one of my past speaking engagements. I had an opportunity last year to go to Florence Black and tell them about being a lawyer. It was a neat experience. I was speaking to fifth graders, and I told a story about a case I had that involved a crane, and I drew pictures and everything. I thought I'd hit a home run. I got some thank you notes from those kids, and they were all great. Normally, I get through about 3 or 4 of them and just kind of put them down and say, "Oh, very cute, very cute." And for some reason, this time, I read all of them. And boy, I'm glad I did. Because I got a thank you note that was addressed to Mr. Noschese. And my hope today is that I do a little bit better at inspiring you than I inspired this young man. Thanks for giving me a little more advice on being a lawyer. I recently wanted to be one. But I see now how much I have to do. And I lazy. So I guess being an attorney isn't in my future. Thanks. So at least he has some self-awareness, but my hope is that he finds some inspiration somewhere. And that today that I'm a little bit better at delivering a message than I was that day. For 10 weeks this summer, David walked us through the 12 steps that form the basis of so many addiction recovery programs. And his development of the individual steps and the process required for each shared perspectives from a pastor, a parishioner, a parent, a community, a family member, and even friends. But in the steps, it's sometimes easy to get overwhelmed, especially for those who have not experienced addiction or its recovery, either as the addict or a friend or family member of the addict. But that was not the case for me this summer. With each new sermon, I got to replay the mental image video loop that no one else has ever seen, but I lived. Maybe you have one. It's that video that begins desperately hopeless, then progresses to redemption, grace, and finally freedom. Like David, I'm Greg, and I'm an alcoholic. And by the grace of God, since March 8th of 1993, I have not felt the need to crawl inside those pretty bottles that they display behind the bar and escape. Today is really not going to be much about anything before March 8th of 1993. If you want to know those details, I'd be happy to share them with you individually, assuming I can remember them. And believe me, there are plenty of things I can't remember. And there are things that I'll only be telling you about because people told me what had happened. Today is really about what happened in the wee hours of March 8th of 1993 and beyond, and what continues to happen each and every day I live without taking that first sip. There are still days and even minutes where my mantra is that I'm not going to take that drink today. Maybe tomorrow, but not today. And God, through you and through others, has continued to help me postpone that drink until tomorrow. And I'm very grateful. Ironically, today I've chosen the book of Esther as the scriptural basis for today's message. It's one of my favorite books in the Bible because it is godless. And yet through it, God empowers people to take action on his behalf and do his work. I say it's godless because it literally is. The word God does not appear anywhere in the book, and it is the only book in the Bible with that glaring omission. Although God does not appear in the book, believers cannot help but see how God was present throughout it. I'm going to jump around the book a bit. You can follow along if you'd like. I'm going to hit many of the high notes, leaving some of the details that are less relevant for what I'm sharing today, just to save time. But since we're Methodists, not Baptists, I didn't think y'all'd mind if I skipped around the book a bit. We begin with verses 1 through 8, and it's a party. King Xerxes is throwing a huge party, and he's pulling out all the stops. Unlike most parties of the day, which required everyone to eat and drink what the king was drinking, and only when the king drank, this one, you could drink whenever, whatever, and however you wanted. You even got to drink off of the king's royal china. And what you really need to picture here is a fraternity party like no other. A bunch of men sitting around for 7 days, and their sole objective is drinking and having a good time. Next door to them is a group of women led by Queen Vashti. And she's giving a banquet for the women in the community. Think of this as the sorority tea. Well, when you have those two contrasts, you can only imagine what might happen next. The men next door sitting there drinking for 7 days, knowing that there's a group of women in the other room. Verse 10. When the king was high in spirits, drunk, he ordered his messengers to go to the queen and bring her to the fraternity party with the crown on her head, to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Queen Vashti was smoking hot, and the king wanted to show her off to all his buddies. But what self-respecting woman would want to answer that kind of call from her man? Come parade in front of all my drunken friends? Verse 12. When the attendants delivered the king's command, Vashti refused to come. Xerxes consulted his advisors, and they declared in verse 16, Queen Vashti has done wrong. And ultimately, they decide to depose Queen Vashti and replace her with a draft pick to be named in the future. Literally. They didn't have anyone to replace her with. And I don't know how many of you have ever watched The Bachelor or America's Top Model, Next Top Model. The basis of those contests has its roots right here in Esther. Because that's what they did to find the next queen. They held a beauty contest in which they sent the commissioners out to go all over Persia and to find beautiful women to come to the king and try out to be king, to be queen. And this is where we meet Uncle Mordecai. Chapter 2, verse 5. He is a Jew from Susa, and he's entrusted with the care of his niece Esther. And throughout her upbringing, he has instructed her not to reveal her Jewish heritage while they're in Persia. Esther is described as lovely in form and features. Yep, just another biblical way of saying smoking hot. Esther ultimately wins Persia's equivalent of America's Next Top Model and The Bachelor, and is ultimately crowned the queen. Once Esther is crowned queen, Mordecai, her uncle, begins to diligently attend the king's gates and listen and see things. He ultimately hears about a plot to kill the king. He tells Esther, Esther tells the king, and the king finds the conspirators and hangs them. Now we come to Haman. And if you are a fan of Star Wars, this is where the Imperial March ought to start in your head. Haman comes in, and he was one of the king's honored officials at the time. And there was a law in place that actually required everyone to bow to Haman when he was at the king's gates. Mordecai refused to bow. And eventually the folks at the gate ask Mordecai to comply with the king's command, yet he still refuses. Haman hears about Mordecai's refusal to bow and persuades the king to allow him to not only kill Mordecai, but to kill the entire Jewish race. Mordecai hears of Haman's plans while at the king's gates. He runs to Esther and encourages Esther to petition the king to intervene on her people's behalf. She refuses. Mordecai sends back the following message, chapter 4, verse 12. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. Esther instructed Mordecai to gather together all the Jews in Susa, fast for 3 days and nights. And when that was done, she would go to the king. Even though it was against the law, even though it meant that it could be her life, she would go. And she told Mordecai, if I perish, I perish. Esther ultimately goes to the king. He hears her petition and ultimately revokes the edict that would have eliminated the Jewish race. And the king has Haman hanged from the very gallows that he had designed and built to hang Mordecai. Throughout this story of Esther, each person had a role ultimately in saving the Jewish people. God's hand saw to it that they were at the right time in the right place. Vashti's refusal to be ogled led to Esther's opportunity to be in a position to influence the kings. Mordecai's training and judicious advice to Esther not to reveal her Jewish heritage led to her ultimately winning that position of favor and being in a position of influence. Mordecai's diligent and vigilant vigils at the king's gates provided the time to make a difference in saving the king and saving a nation. Esther's grace, beauty, elegance, and trust built and established a rapport that gave her credibility when she needed it most. But her restraint as to her heritage and using her influential position only after prayer and only when it was absolutely necessary is what really distinguished her. Each of these folks were in the right time and the right place and allowed God to work through them by doing what came natural to them. What they had in common, though, is what all right time, right place people have in common. They prepared themselves to respond at that time. They were courageous, they were faithful in attendance, and attentive to others, By placing others' needs before their own, they listened. They held others accountable at the right time. I have had the experience of right time, right place people, and I truly believe that they have saved my life. It began on March 8th when I called that volunteer-staffed Washington, D.C. intergroup for Alcoholics Anonymous. It took courage for me to make that call, but I was sick and tired of alcohol controlling me, and I wanted out. It had invaded my spirit and planted itself inside of me, turning me into a hopeless mess of selfishness and despair. The person who answered that phone that night didn't recognize me by name, but knew me by the symptoms, and simply suggested I attend a meeting just down the street from my dorm room. I went. The phone answerer, she was there. She talked, I talked, we listened, I met others. They suggested I come back and that I go to another meeting during my work hours. I worked on Capitol Hill. They told me about a meeting that meets in the early morning right below the House chamber. I went. I met Vance there. Vance was always there. Vance and I shared our experiences, and so did others. I kept going back because that's what Vance and others told me to do. I listened. After a couple of months, I started to get anxious. After all, I was wrapping up my senior year in college. I was scheduled to graduate in just a few weeks, move to Texas, get married, go on a honeymoon, then move to Lubbock and start law school. I had so many fears and anxieties running through my head. And until that moment, all I had ever done to cope with those was turn to a bottle. I was worried about whether my fiancée, Regine, would still love me if I were sober. Would our relationship be the same or worse if I were sober? How do I meet new people sober? Why the heck am I moving to a dry town? How will my law school classmates treat me sober? But more importantly, how can I dance at my wedding sober? One morning, just below the House chamber, I shared with Vance those anxieties, those fears, and he listened. Then he asked, "Did you say you were going to law school in Lubbock, Texas, at Texas Tech Law School?" My reply, yes. Then Vance, the one person I had met at that House chamber, out of all of the other folks I could have met, out of that big metropolitan area, Washington, D.C., Vance simply took a business card from his pocket. He flipped it over. He wrote the name Richard on it and a phone number. "When you get to Lubbock, call this guy." Richard is my brother. He is an alcoholic and just finished at Texas Tech Law School. And he's in a group of recovering alcoholic lawyers that meet at 4 p.m. at a small law office 2 blocks from the law school. He will be expecting your call. When I got to Lubbock, I called Richard, and he simply responded, "I hope you would call." Vance said you would. We met together and worked together as recovering alcoholics to liberate our true spirits from the life the bottled spirits had created. And to this day, it continues to work because God has continued to place people like each of you for me at the right time and at the right place to draw me closer to Him, His grace, and His mercy. No one ever told Vashti, Mordecai, or Esther that God put them where they were or led them to the decisions they made. But it all worked out so well and so scripted. Nobody told the call taker at the DC intergroup, Vance or Richard, of the significance that they would play in my recovery or how God would work through them to bring me closer to Him. They simply had the courage to answer a phone, the patience to listen to a drunk at the end of his rope, and the wisdom to know when to speak and when to listen. My hope and prayer is that each of you will have the opportunity to have the conviction of Vashti, the accountability of Mordecai, and the patience and wisdom of Esther to empower others to action. And if you do, you will be the anonymous call taker, the Vance, and the Richard, helping a sinner ultimately find their Redeemer. And my hope is that you never know the role you played. We need to keep in mind what the inspired pastor Chuck Swindoll once said: time is short, opportunity is knocking. Please answer it. The age-old aphorism remains true: 4 things never come back: the spoken word, the spent arrow, time past, the neglected opportunity. For a long time, I knew of God, but never had a relationship with Him. The God I knew then, He was a punitive God, the ever-present corrector who was there to punish me for my sins. My experience as a consumer of God's hands and feet in this world through that anonymous call taker, through Vance, and then Richard, has taught me that God is a God of love and grace, who has sought and wanted the best relationship with Him, not only for me, but for all of us. And if you have ever labored under that same misimpression of God, a God who seeks punishment rather than delivers redemption, I invite you to learn about God in a whole new way through this community, through the hands and feet that it shares. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.